All right, so welcome back to our period cast, I guess we could call it. If you missed the first episode on the menstrual cycle, female hormones, and birth control, well, we'd highly recommend that you go and take a listen to that one. But today we'll be digging in a little bit deeper, answering some more of your guys' questions on symptom management, going off birth control, fertility, and as well as how symptoms related to your cycle may change as we age. So a lot of interesting things coming your way. And once again, we're joined by Coach Clare and Coach Kat, who both have extensive experience and knowledge and education in the realm of female hormones and the menstrual cycle. And for the purposes of this episode, menopause as well. So one of the main topics we'll be covering, that we covered in the first part of the series was about how, as a woman goes through the different stages of the menstrual cycle, this can affect training and nutrition in different ways. So if you're interested in listening to that, head over to the first episode. But one of the questions that we received was, how should you change your macros to suit your cycle? So I thought it would be helpful to kind of go through this again a little bit and maybe give some more practical takeaways. So yeah, if you ladies like to share your thoughts, Claire?
Yeah, well, I think we've had some great response from the first episode. And in that response, I've had plenty of clients approach me now, having listened, going, okay, how can I change my nutrition and how can I cycle my carbs to help manage symptoms or get more from my training and perform better or lose weight faster? Some people, again, are clutching at these quick fixes and think if they cycle carbs around their menstrual cycle, they're going to lose weight faster. So I think Kat and I both strongly agree that really we need to get the basics right first. And that's what we'll talk about initially. Tailoring your nutrition and your training around your menstrual cycle is the icing on the cake, the cherry on top. You need to get your nutrition right first. You need to get the basics right first. Like, are you following a plan? Are you able to stay adherent to that plan? Is it working for you? Are you hitting your calories? Are you getting enough protein? And then are you exercising enough to reach your goals? If you're nailing all of that stuff and you want to fine tune things and you want to improve your performance, then absolutely we can look at that and we can kind of go down that rabbit hole with you. But I think you have to get the basics right first. The only exception to that rule would be if you are having symptoms that are debilitating and really having an impact on your life, then there is plenty we can do to help from the get-go. Yeah, and then, you know, there can be very simple nutritional tweaks as well that can be very effective. So I'd just say get the basics right, and then we can look at fine-tuning things. And absolutely, we can start cycling carbs and calories around your cycle, just like we can change the way you train to suit your cycle.
I mean, yeah, you nailed it on the head there, right? It's ensure you're getting consistency with your approach to training and nutrition basics before we go trying to reinvent the wheel and get really in depth on this. I think two things that Claire said that are worth highlighting is if you've got debilitating symptoms, then yeah, we want to jump in and we want to address that right away. In many cases, not every single case, but in most cases, those debilitating symptoms are pronounced when we aren't on any sort of nutritional plan. So again, it's just going to be getting ourselves and making sure that our baseline is covered. And generally that'll bring those debilitating symptoms down quite a bit. And the other thing is exercise, right? Nutrition is so important to making you feel good. But in terms of hormonal regulation, and this is very uncommon, but if you are someone who does have kind of an altered hormonal profile, right? So you've got really high estrogen levels or something like that, or even relative to your progesterone, exercise will help to normalize those hormone profiles a little bit. And so ensuring that you're getting some form of daily activity is going to be absolutely key for that. If you're in a position where you can do high intensity exercise, there is some research that suggests that we can get even more bang for our buck there, but we certainly don't want to go couch to 100, right, with that. And so just getting any form of movement and activity in there is massive.
I think, we preach a lot of the time, this idea of consistency over perfection. And I think there's a whole nother kind of realm to it when it comes to, just trying to nail down the consistency of one piece of the puzzle before moving on to something else. And I think, related to this most definitely, but just a whole whack of things. Like people, if they get their macros perfect for 1 week, they're okay, like let's make a change. Like what more can I do? Or if their training goes really well for a week, it's like, okay, let's bump it up a notch. But I think one of the most like underrated and almost under celebrated wins when it comes to nutrition and training is consistency. Like, okay, great, you nailed that for a week, can you do that for 3 months? I think people are always wanting to switch things up or do more, or try a different approach, and that's where all these fad diets and things that we see on Instagram of how to manage period pains and that sort of thing kind of get too much spotlight, when really it's just, if you can get the basics down for a really extended period of time, that's when you're really going to see the changes. So I think that's a really important message through all this too.
Definitely. And I think that that is so true when we're talking about kind of period cycles and those being month-long cycles. And okay, so you change something, you nail something for a week, like we're talking about a third of a cycle there, right? And generally any sort of nutritional change that you make takes a while to take effect. So while you could be, yes, integrating more flax and yam and all of these hormonally supportive foods, let's make sure that you have an appropriate level of like carb and fat intake relative to your activity first. And let's make sure that we're not just doing that for a week. It's going to need to be months, right? Oftentimes what we see is for our athletes, and I love when I've worked with people for 12 months or 24 months, a really long time, my females, you get to know their cycles very well. And I can tell you before they even start their cycle whether it's going to be a good or a bad period for them, just based on how on or off program they've been in that month leading up to it. And so it's not necessarily what you eat or consume just the week prior to your period, but if they've been stressed and over consuming caffeine or sugar, they've not been hydrating, they've not been exercising, their protein intake has been low, they're much more likely to have more painful periods, to be more bloated, to see a bigger weight increase on the scale, all of those kind of negative symptoms. And trying to fix that up in the last week before your cycle isn't going to change things. It's what we do the month ahead, right?
Yeah, and I think also you've got to look at your cycle over a number of months before you start to make any changes. People might think, oh, they hear about cycling nutrition to suit their menstrual cycle and start doing this tomorrow. Whereas actually, do you know what happens to you through your cycle? Have you tracked it for a few months? Do you know how you feel, at ovulation or in your luteal phase? You know how you feel when you start bleeding? Because it's different for everyone. And unless you are aware of the changes you experience, we can't make nutritional changes to suit that or to support that. So it's definitely not a quick fix, which some people might grab onto. It's a long-term process, and that's what Kat, when Kat said she's working with people for 6, 12, 24 months, it gives us such a great insight into their cycle, and we're probably sometimes more likely to notice their rhythms more than they are. They've got so many other things going on, it's our job just to pay attention to that and that only. So it really gives us a good opportunity when you work with people long term to work on things like that.
Mm-hmm. So say, for those cases where people are continuously experiencing those, debilitating symptoms and everything else is in check, are there any sort of go-tos, or, what are the most common approaches to managing those symptoms, whether it be the specific foods that you eat, or things maybe unrelated to nutrition? What are some of the go-tos?
I would always recommend to my females start journaling, just making some notes. If their appetite is affected during their cycle, like for the people who it's debilitating, their appetite is usually massively affected on the lead up to their period. So I like them to keep some notes. What am I craving? Is it carby food, salty food, sugary food? Am I becoming more reliant on caffeine because I'm tired? Am I relying more on alcohol because I feel stressed out? Kind of trying to identify triggers and watch what they go for. And then I deal with the triggers in the first place. So if you are reaching for caffeine because you're tired, maybe it's a time to pull back on your training, approach it as a deload week. Maybe you need more rest. take a nap, go to bed earlier, try and nip these things in the bud. And I think with appetite as well, what are you reaching for? And if you went for it, how did it make you feel? And just make a note of that. So next time, think, okay, I'm not going to reach for the salty, carby foods. I'm going to up my veggies and my water and see how that makes me feel. So yeah, I do get them to do quite a lot. Some people love journaling, other people it's just making some notes in their diary, but it's really useful to look back on it month on month and spot the patterns, and so we can nip things in the bud.
I would say probably for me, the single biggest thing that I go to with my clients is hydration levels. And so hydration, when you are dehydrated, and even kind of like a 2% drop in hydration can have a massive effect on your performance, but also the amount of pain and discomfort that you feel because it affects your prostaglandins, right? And so for me, hydration levels are absolutely massive. And often what happens is people alter their sodium consumption in the lead up to their period, which can affect hydration, especially dependent on the season. Depending on training, you may see water intake decrease or just be low at baseline. More than that, what I see is caffeine increases, alcohol increases, and both of those things will dehydrate you, right? So oftentimes for my weightlifters, for instance, if they have to make weight for a competition and we know they're going to be on day one of their cycle at weigh-in, but they're close on weight, they don't necessarily need to do a cut. All we'll do is we'll push that water intake way up because we can combat a lot of the bloat that goes along with their period, and they'll actually come in underweight that way. So that's a strategy that applies not only to competitive weightlifters, but to everyone. If we can increase your hydration and pull back on things that increase prostaglandin synthesis and kind of your awareness of pain, so those caffeine, alcohol, sugar type items, then we're probably in for a much better cycle. So that's always my number one go-to. It sounds super easy. It's one of the harder ones to be consistently good at until you've really created that habit for yourself. And then it's just, cruise along with it.
And I think the women who find it the hardest are generally the ones that are hit with exhaustion before their period. That's when it's hardest to have the willpower to stay away from the food that you're craving or make the smarter choices. We all know that when we're tired, the likelihood of consuming more calories goes up. So, knowing that you're someone who gets hit with exhaustion, then think about that, put strategies in around that. Like I said before, more sleep, pull back on your training, get some naps in. That will just make such a big difference, and start doing it before the exhaustion even hits. If it hits you on day 25, then start thinking about that on day 21, 22. Start banking that extra rest.
And probably another thing that goes along with that, dependent on how you approach your meal prep and things for the week, but especially if you're someone who's not maybe a prepper, knowing that exhaustion hits you on a certain day, have that prep done for the next few days so that there are things to grab that are relatively good choices. Have some like high quality nutrient dense muffins or balls, have some proteins and veggies made, because when you're exhausted, the last thing I want to do is go cook chicken and veggies for dinner, right?
Yeah.
But if it's there, if it's sitting in the fridge and all I have to do is dollop some hummus on top, I'm much more likely to go for it.
Yeah. And communicate with your coach as well. If you have someone who has a coach for your training, don't be embarrassed about telling them, even if it's a younger guy and you think you might not get it. Well, they should get it. So they're training you. So don't be embarrassed to have those conversations with your trainer too. So they can, deload you that week if you need it. If that's what you need. I mean, for some of my clients, we don't do any kind of training. We do mobility or yoga, or I tell them to don't even come if they're exhausted and in tears or whatever. Stay home, meditate. Yeah.
One of my favorite go-tos, if those sugar cravings are creeping up, is the MTM peanut butter almond cups. Always have those on hand in the freezer.
Yum.
Great. And is there any, I don't know, we've never really touched on this, but would there be any supplements that you've, used in the past for clients, or any kind of, any sort of supplement regimes?
I don't really. I mean, I look at supplements for women who are suffering symptoms of menopause a little bit more so, but PMS, it's generally just really good nutrition, the right sort of exercise for them, managing their symptoms without supplementation. I mean, there's lots of supplements we can recommend and often do, but it's not necessarily specific towards the menstrual cycle, unless obviously someone has an iron deficiency, then that has to be addressed. But generally, no. First is food, getting it right with food. Yeah.
The only other one that I might recommend in the lead up to your period is increasing your magnesium intake for, especially the week prior, in the evenings, increasing that leading in, especially if you're someone who suffers from constipation with their period, then maybe go for a magnesium citrate. If you don't suffer from constipation, then maybe another form of magnesium is a better choice. But the magnesium can really help with a lot of like the menstrual cramping and things like that. And there is good evidence for it. But aside from iron, only if needed, and magnesium, there's nothing I would ever blanket recommend. And certainly I would be extremely cautious of any sort of synthetic hormone or adaptogen that mimics hormone action. And I think people get sucked into that very easily, and they don't necessarily realize what a profound effect those things can have on their system and their hormone levels. And we can really compound a lot of problems. And that's a whole other tangent, regulation of the supplement industry insofar as talking about those sort of things is concerned. But I would be very cautiously staying away from that unless recommended by a physician for a very specific diagnosed reason. Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Specific. And many people are, especially maybe when people who are my age now, when we were younger, we were often, recommended by the doctor to go on birth control if our symptoms were really bad. And so we talked about this quite a bit in the last episode. But then we got a question come in that was, okay, so if I have been on birth control for X amount of years and I want to go off, but originally the reason to go on was to manage symptoms, what might happen when I go off birth control, and how would I manage those symptoms as they come up?
I think that's a really great question, and something that's so important is that your cycle will change over time, right? So what you experience as a teenager may be very different to kind of young adulthood, maybe different to, after having a baby, or when, once you're past 30. And so I think it is wise to check in with your own body and see how you are coping with things from time to time. If you've been on birth control since you were 14 years old and you're in your early 30s, you have absolutely no idea what to expect. And so if you're not using birth control as a method of birth control, and you're curious about what you're going to feel going off of it, generally we would expect to see you return to normal, as in your ovulatory cycle will return to normal. Again, we talked about last week how the different birth control methods of birth control work, and so some of them have a bigger impact than others. Essentially the pill is probably especially the combo pill, is going to have your biggest impact, and that should all normalize within a month to 2 months. So you should be able to see pretty quickly once you come off something, what things are going to look like for you. And I think, Claire was talking about journaling, and we have most of our clients use a tracker. I have them use like a flow app to log their symptoms. Coming off off birth control, you really want to log and see where you're at, and be ensuring that you're addressing the nutrition and exercise leading into it, right? Because if you decide to go off birth control in the middle of a very stressful period where you're not getting your exercise in, you're not prepping, you're not, which I see all the time. I'm like, well, why would you choose to come off right now? You are going to see some differing symptoms, and it might take you a couple months to stabilize, but it certainly shouldn't be 4 or 5 or 6 months. If you're experiencing very erratic or severe symptoms that long after coming off birth control, then it's probably something that needs to be looked into a bit further, right? And I think the really important thing to address here is, what type of birth control am I coming off? if you're coming off like, you know, a Mirena, okay, well, you're obviously going to resume bleeding at some point, right? Once your endometrium builds up. Same with your Kyleena, same with your, you know, your copper IUDs probably would have had that anyways. Progesterone only pills, you're probably going to see pretty minimal effect. Combo pills, you're going to see more of an effect, but it's super specific. So what you're going to see, we don't know. We kind of have to test it out. But then we would just treat it like we would anyone else, right? Nailing those basics. And then if we need to, resorting to kind of the advanced nutrition.
And what if somebody was going off of birth control for the purposes of fertility?
Oh, this is a really interesting one. And I've had a couple people ask this question. And essentially, so usually when we're talking about this, we're talking about having been on birth control for a prolonged period of time, years and years and years. With any sort of birth control, you should essentially be back to a ovulatory normal function within 1 to 2 months. Again, with your IUDs, it's pretty immediate. With the ring and an implant, it's kind of immediate to 1 month to normalize. With the pill, it can be 1 to 2 months for ovulation to resume, but it's pretty quick. So this idea that I need to come off birth control and it's going to take 6 months for me to get my period back and to be able to have, you know, have kids is inaccurate. But what does happen is we have a natural degradation and loss of eggs over time, right? And so if you've been on birth control since you were 14 and you're now 30, your egg quality and amount is going to be lower. How low, how high, we really don't know unless we start doing tests like your anti-Mullerian reserve, et cetera. And so it's that, and also natural changes in progesterone that would impact your levels of fertility. And those are normal physiological changes associated with aging. Those are not related to your birth control. So it could take you 6 months or longer to get pregnant, but it's not necessarily a result of the pill. That's just kind of your baseline body. So if you are concerned about fertility, generally what's recommended is if you're 35 or older and you've been off birth control, trying to conceive for greater than 6 months, that's when you would kind of seek out some medical help. If you're under 35, we would typically suggest that you can try for about a year before needing to seek help with that. But it really, again, after that first month to 2 months off it doesn't have an impact. Then we're just dealing with, okay, where's my body at personally, right? And of course, other factors like stress and stuff can play a role too. So
one of the other questions that we got was, is it normal for period symptoms to escalate past 30? So this is probably a good one for you, Claire. And I would assume that it ties into, you know, tracking your cycle for the years leading up to that too, and perhaps why it's so important to start that as soon as possible as well.
Yeah, well, we can start seeing changes in your menstrual cycle from, 30 is very early, but it happens for perimenopause. And then the changes there's so many symptoms, like the list is endless. You know, if you just Google symptoms of menopause, it just goes on and on. But changes in your menstrual cycle would present themselves in your cycle getting longer or shorter. Your periods may become heavier or longer. We don't say that you're officially in menopause until you've not had a period for a year. I've known some people not have a period for a year and then get a period. You know, it can be that unpredictable. And some months you may have a breeze and think everything's okay, and then it can come back with a vengeance. So unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rules around it. I wish I could say you're going to experience X, Y, and Z, and it's going to last for this long, but there's so many symptoms, and it can last for such a varied period of time as well. It affects everyone so differently. But yeah, it is normal. If that's what the question was, it is normal to see symptoms escalate past 30 years of age. Absolutely. You don't hear about it as often. It's more likely post 40, but it doesn't mean it can't happen. Yeah. I would.
Sorry, go ahead.
I would just say if those symptoms really become unmanageable, then absolutely go and speak to your GP about it and get their opinion on whether they think, it could be the menopause starting or perimenopause starting. Yeah.
I think I agree with what you said. It's not spoken about because I think particularly in maybe that 30 to 35 or even 30 to 40 age range, it just doesn't even enter our minds that, oh, this could be perimenopause because we're so young. That doesn't happen until way down the road, way down the road.
Yeah.
And it's really important to recognize that hormonal changes do start to happen usually around 35 for most women, give or take a couple of years. That doesn't mean that you're going to go into full-blown menopause prior to 40 or prior to 45. You can have those low-level symptom changes for years and years and years. And it's also not a negative thing either, right? But again, we've kind of learned to adapt to our normal and our cycles throughout our lifetime. And then all of a sudden they start changing in our mid-30s, which is typically when people like to have a lot of control over their lives. We've got our routines, we're set in our ways, and then you kind of throw a wrench into things. And I think that rather than be fearful of it, what we need to do is look at it as an opportunity to, I always say to my clients, like, periods are great. We always complain about them, but they're this great built-in warning system for females. It's this red flag that, hey, like something's maybe not right in my body. And what I mean by that is, if you've had a normal period and all of a sudden now it's not normal, it's a great way of telling us something's going on that needs to be attended to, right? And I think that kind of having some hormonal changes in your mid-30s is also not a negative thing because it draws your attention back to this, and it kind of brings you back to, okay, this is starting to change. I'm not loving it. What can I do to make things better for myself? And addressing those nutritional and exercise and lifestyle factors, stress factors that can so heavily impact it, right?
Yeah.
It's a good opportunity to check in with ourselves, and we need to look at it as that instead of, oh no, my life is ending, right?
Yeah. And I think it's really common to see your cycle be very, very different after you've had children as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like your periods might be completely different after childbearing. So if you're in your 30s, your body is very different if you've been having children, and your lifestyle is probably very different now to life before kids. So there's two big factors there that can also change your cycle markedly. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean menopause is coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like there should be a rule book for all of this and just like guidelines, but it's never going to be that straightforward.
And there's so much variability. That's the other thing, right? So, it's never going to be the same as the person next to you, which I think often when we're a bit on the younger end, experience tends to be a little bit more homogenous. Whether it actually is or that's just our perception, who knows? But as we kind of get a bit older, I find people are very divergent and experience things so differently. And again, not a bad thing. It just means you need to figure out yourself and not compare to others, and do the journaling, do the tracking, do the logging, whatever you have to do to make yourself feel good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest takeaway is the importance of tracking your own cycle so that where you are and your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I've had some female clients start tracking, and they are fully expecting to see that luteal phase, so the time in your cycle between ovulation and your period, to see a dip in their performance, a dip in mood, dip in energy, increase in appetite, all the kind of stereotypical symptoms. And they've started tracking, they're like, I get none of that. I feel amazing, and it's such a surprise because they don't fit that stereotype. I'm like, well, thank goodness that we tracked, because otherwise you could have started doing things completely upside down. So, going back to the importance of tracking, it really is, because we are all so different.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Knowledge is power. And I think it's important too to be aware of how you are responding to the different phases of your cycle, so that you don't, think, okay, I'm supposed to feel down and my performance is supposed to be down during this week, and then kind of feed into that. Because if that's not the case, then you obviously don't want that to be the case. So let's try and be aware of when maybe we have it a little bit better than baseline or the typical, cycle that we might see. Well, thank you again, ladies. I think we covered all of the questions that we'd received. If there's any last pieces of advice from either of you.
I think Claire just summed it up so nicely. Like, you really need to focus on yourself and what is true for you, and not worry about all of these differences that everyone else can have, but get to know you, track you, and observe rather than kind of project onto yourself what things are going to be like, right? And understand that nothing is static, things can change, it's once we get a handle on it, then of course it's going to go a little bit sideways. I feel like is always the rule.
No two periods are the same, I say to my clients. And so then you just have to accept, if you're going to start looking into those things a little bit deeper, you expect it to take time. None of this is an overnight fix. Trial and error. Keep journaling, keep tracking your symptoms, use an app, whatever you need to do for a good few months. And then once we see what your cycle's doing, accept there's going to be another good few months of trying to figure out what suits you best. And accept that might change month on month too. So just have an open mind and just embrace the fact that, like Kat said, our body just gives us such a great warning system for things that are going on. So, be thankful that we've got that system going on, and we're given the opportunity to support ourselves.
Absolutely.
And if you ever, want somebody to help keep you accountable to being consistent with the tracking, and a second eye to look over your symptoms and help guide you so that you can perform your best through all phases of your cycle, we are there for you, and we'd be happy to sit down for a chat. So details will be below on how to do so if you want to get in touch with one of the MTMM coaches.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Otherwise, we will see you in the next episode. If anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us or leave them down below, and we'll make sure to attend to them in the near future.
Awesome. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Kat.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, ladies.